Folks, listen.
Welcome to another episode of D&M, bringing questions for you that we find interesting. We don't know until the other person says, and bring a mystery to the table for all the generations. Two people from two different backgrounds trying to make sound about the world around us. They both bringing light to the questions they ask. Dina and Michael sliding in your DMs with class. Hey, it's D&M. Hey, it's D&M. D&M. It's D&M. Hey, it's D&M.
Welcome back to Sliding with D&M. This is the fourth episode of our series, and we decided to switch it up a little bit this week. We reached out to our viewers to submit questions, so these are two user-submitted questions, and Dina's going to start us off this week.
Hi, how's it going?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm doing well. So, my question is a little bit inspired actually by you, Michael.
Uh-oh.
I know, right?
Okay.
So, as you all know, Michael's in school. He's studying to be a business major and do business. And he is taking a course this semester about childhood books. So
Mhm.
my question for you is, what childhood books inspired you?
So I didn't really read a lot as a kid. Like I really didn't. This is actually a question that our professor asked us, that like what childhood books are memorable to you as a kid.
Mhm.
And um I mean, like I don't know. I didn't really read a lot as a kid. I think we should define like what childhood is. You know what I mean? Because like in my mind, when I think about childhood, I think like from like the ages that you can start reading to like I don't know, like sixth grade.
Okay,
You know
so
what I mean?
all right, that makes sense. Okay, so let me revamp my question a little bit.
Okay.
So, because I think childhood is such a broad thing, because I mean, do you really remember what you were doing at 5 years old?
No,
Probably
no, and
not.
that's the thing is like I mean, even if I did remember the books that I read, they probably weren't like very impactful. You know what I mean? Like when you think about like children's literature for like young ages, it's like The Hungry Caterpillar or like whatever that book is called. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, totally. Okay, so I guess I should probably say, what was the first book or the first series of books? And it doesn't have to be a book that's in a series, but what were some
Hmm.
of the first books that you remember reading that had such an impact of what you thought and kind of changed what you thought was one thing and impacted you to think outside the box and change to another?
Okay, that's a good one. All right. In that case, I would say when I first read The Giver, you know the book The Giver?
Yes, I do know The Giver.
Yeah, so like that book is about like this alternate civilization basically where this you grow up and you're expected to go into a role, and the main character gets placed in the role of the giver who keeps memories basically. Um they also control like the weather, and they're very advanced, but I think that specifically changed my mind on things just because it was a little bit futuristic, but it was also very easy to delve into and believe that you know what I mean, like that it could actually exist.
Mhm.
So that would definitely be one of mine. I don't really know what else. I read Divergent, but I feel like that wasn't really like that impactful, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I read all 3 of the books of Divergent, and they were fine. They were,
Mhm.
I think the first one was the best one out of all 3 of them.
Yeah, that's the one that I read, and then after that, I was just kind of like, "This is good enough," and I
So,
stopped.
um, obviously, I read all 3 of the Hunger Games. I really like the Hunger Games as well. Obviously, I'm reading these as an adult, so I'll tell you my choice of books here in a second, that had an impact on me when I was growing up. So I read The Hunger Games, and it's funny that my daughter is currently reading The Hunger Games for her class right now. So, so for me, one of the very first books I remember having such an impact on me was A Wrinkle in Time. And that book changed how I thought about time per se. Does that make sense? And
Hmm.
how time is such a relative thing, and we make it what we want to make it.
Hmm.
And then also, I clearly remember that that was the first book that I had read that the main character was a black little girl. Up
Yeah,
until
that's what
that
I was gonna say.
up until that point, I hadn't really read any books where the main character looked like me, right? And
So
so
let me ask you this, because this is actually something that we have started to discuss in my class. So there's a lot of controversy in the literature world on how characters and stories are written to not include a diverse group of people, right?
yes.
And I don't know the exact statistics, but it's about like 50% of childhood books are the main characters are white, and then it's like 20% are animals, and then like a measly, I don't know, 10% are black people, and then Hispanic and Native American are very, very small. So
Okay.
what was that like growing up? Because when I read books, there was I never really felt that. I never really felt like there was nobody that didn't look like me, you know what I mean, or that I couldn't relate to. So
Yes.
what was that like growing up, and just not experiencing somebody like you in a fictional setting or in a different storytelling setting?
Um I think for me, because, you know, I lived in such a predominantly white community, I don't think I thought so much about it until I read A Wrinkle in Time. And by the way, that's probably one of the first books that I read cover to cover straight through. I did
Hmm.
not put it down because, like I said, there was a character that looked like me. She had thoughts like me. She was a little African American girl trying to find her way. And I had never read anything like that. Not that the books that I had read previously were bad books, but that was the first time I had read a book where I could truly identify with a character. I think one of my other favorite books that I read in high school that I read in English class were Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. Love, love, love that book. And another book that I read was Let the Circle Be Unbroken. Like, those books were books to me that, they're set back in time, but they were about the African American struggle, and the characters were female characters who were African American who were trying to find their way. And I hadn't read very many books like that because, I mean, think about what you read in high school. I mean, you read your typical, I don't know. Let's see. Well, now it's a little bit different, but you read like Of Mice and Men, and you
Hmm.
read Catcher in the Rye. Like, and so it's not that they're great books, but I
Yeah.
think as a young African American woman at that time, reading books that truly identified with, me, like these were women who were characters that were me that I could so relate to, even though the book was set in the past, in the
Yeah.
past in the story, but I could understand how they were feeling. I could feel what they were feeling. I think another book that I really identified with was The Invisible Man. I love that book because there are times when you are an African American, you feel kind of invisible. Like that you're not really there, but you are there.
Yeah.
And so I just remember those books being so impactful to me as I was reading as a young adult. And so I hope that, and I think I mean, listen, reading is one of those lifelong skills. You have to practice it. You have to keep using it. And I think it's important that you read things outside of your comfort zone because that's how you learn and grow, right? Because if you keep reading the same stuff, like everybody has a genre that they like, you know. Some people like
Mhm.
romance, people like mystery. I really like John Grisham. I really love like the law stories and trying to figure out the puzzle pieces. But I also think it's important that you read things that are outside of your comfort zone, that are necessarily not easy to read, because it helps you learn and grow. Like for instance, for a while I was part of a book club, and one of the books that we read, and it is and now listen, the story is very serious, okay, but it's told with a bit of humor. It's called I Am Not Myself These Days, and it was about a drag queen who basically during the day had a job in New York City that was a high powered job, and they were finance, but at night nobody really knew this. He was a drag queen, and he wore these platform shoes that had fishes, and he was also a coke addict too. But right? And so that total juxtaposition of the story, but that
Yeah.
was another book, that we read, and I read that straight through cover to cover, and he wound up turning himself around, and, I believe, if I remember correctly, he wound up being on that TV show, The Amazing Race, him and his partner. They were goat farmers, and I think they won. I believe they won that season of Amazing Race. I could be wrong.
Interesting.
Yes, but how his life had taken a drastic turn, and he kind of chronicled what he did. And that story, I loved it so much, and I related to it because one, in my younger years, I used to backup dance for a drag queen, right? A little interesting tidbit. But
Yes.
anyway, and so I, his stories of, when he was at the clubs and he was dancing and doing this, now I couldn't relate to all of that, you know what I mean? But I could understand it, but it also caused me to think outside of the box that, you know, he was kind of living this dual life, you know. He had his I'm proper life during the day, but his other life, which he kind of felt a little bit of ashamed, which he shouldn't have felt ashamed for that. I mean, nowadays, like, I mean, there's RuPaul's Drag Race, like like everybody knows drag queens and
But
loves
I
the
think I think it's also very important to note the environment that he was in. Finance and business alike are very professional fields, right? You're supposed to look a certain way, you're supposed to dress a certain way, you're supposed to be clean shaven for men. You know what I mean? Women are expected to wear suit jackets with skirts or pants or whatever, right? Everybody's supposed to look and act a certain way to keep the professionality of it.
yes,
And his life was in part playing two different roles, right? So
yes,
he was playing the role of a financier on Wall Street, right? And
yes.
then at night he was playing the role of a drag queen. So he never really got to become himself, right?
I would agree with that. I would agree with that. Anyway, so that's another good book, friends. Read that. I'm Not Myself These Days. Yes, super. I mean, it has humor. It's told with a little bit of humor because he's looking back on his life, but it also causes you to think outside the box. And I think that's what books are supposed to do. Books are supposed to make you feel uncomfortable. Those books that bring about change, right? And that's what change is. Change happens when you become uncomfortable, right?
Yeah.
And you're like, I have to do something because I'm uncomfortable. Either I keep with this feeling or I change. And so I think that's what books are meant to do. And I think the really good books challenge us to do that, you know um figure out what is change and how we can change it. And so I really, like I said, I really, when I was growing up, A Wrinkle in Time, that book was the book for me because
Mhm.
it was the first time that I had ever read anything where the main character looked like me, she thought like me, and she was trying to figure things out. I mean, I don't really think up until that point I had read a book anything like that. And I remember reading that book when I was about 11. which would be probably about the age of my daughter. And just thinking, wow, like my mind was blown. Like, oh my gosh, there's books about little black girls, right? I mean,
Hmm.
because up until that point, I hadn't really read anything like that. And so, and like I said,
Do you think that's a common realization in the Black community, that like not a lot is out there that actually accurately represents your culture and who you are?
I think people are starting to realize it more and more. You know, I mean, I'm a child of the 80s and the 90s. So back then, I think it was just, oh, this is what it is. This is what we're
Hmm.
doing. These are the books we're reading, you know. I don't think it has now become more commonplace and more mainstream to be like, hey, there's not enough books out here that tell the African American story or help young girls to identify, you know, with people or young men too, that
Hmm.
these people look like me and think like me and act like me or have some type of resemblance or some type of oh, excuse me, characteristic. So I think it's getting better. I hope it continues to get better.
Hmm.
I think it's important that we have that representation, and not just for African Americans. I think it's important we have that representation across the board for every type of culture. I think it's so important, so important that kids can see that, instead of
Yeah.
just reading the same old, same old. So, but I also think it's important to read the same old too, because those teach us lessons as well. So
Hmm.
I think we have to try to find that middle ground and start to find a balance. And hopefully it is starting to happen and you're starting to see it more and more.
Yeah.
But like I said, back in the 80s and 90s, when I was a kid, that wasn't even really thought of, and A Wrinkle in Time, I mean, today it's considered a classic. It was kind of a new classic back then. Does that make sense?
Hmm.
And so I I don't even really remember why I picked it up from the school library. That's so funny when I think about the school library. I mean, but that's where you went to get books. You went to the school library. Like you had library class once a week. And once a week you went and you got to pick out a book from the library. You know what I'm talking about. And I
Hmm.
don't even know why I picked that book. I have no clue. I was walking up and down the library aisles and I was like, this one looks good. And I remember even thinking too, why am I reading this book? It's so many pages, right? Because to an
Yeah.
11-year-old, 300 pages plus is a lot of pages to read. But I
Hmm.
remember once I started reading it, I couldn't put it down. It was such a good book. And so I highly encourage everyone to read A Wrinkle in Time. There has been a movie also, by the way, if you have not seen the movie as well. So, but yeah, I just think it was such a good book. And it made me for the first time realize that there are books about young little girls who look like me.
Hmm. See, I think that that realization is kind of morphing into something new nowadays. I don't think it's become less about reading and more the overall story of somebody, right? So
Yeah.
like now we have TV shows, we have movies, we have documentaries, we have audio recordings, you know what I mean? People have home movies. So I think it's really becoming more about telling somebody's story. And the interesting thing is that telling somebody's story is arguably far easier than writing something down, right? It takes skill and a lot of effort and time and money to sit down and write a book, right?
Oh, for sure.
But telling somebody's story through a documentary that you take a week to shoot, right? Or home movies, which are just little clips that people make, I think those are sometimes even more impactful than books, right?
I think so, but I also think that reading is there's a beauty about reading, right? Because the beauty about reading is that you can imagine the things that are coming off the page. No one
Hmm.
is implanting that image into your head. It's
Yeah.
what you want to create that world. The words are there, right? The words are
Hmm.
there, but at the same time, you can make your own interpretation of those words. And I really think that reading is becoming kind of a lost art.
Oh
Reading
yeah,
just
100%.
reading
100%.
just reading just to read, not reading because you have to read this for English class or read this for this class or read
I
this.
think that's where it exactly, because I really don't like reading all that much. I'll be the first person to tell you that. I'm more of a, if I want legitimate information or something interesting, I really do prefer documentaries. I appreciate a really nice made documentary.
Yes.
But I think the main reason why I don't like reading so much that I do is because of the school system and having to constantly be reading novels and books for class, and it was something that I was never interested in, and the stories were never all that interesting to me. So I feel like that's where my disappreciation comes, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I would have to agree with you with that with some level. And I I really wish that teachers would um and my middle son's 10th grade English teacher kind of did this a little bit. Not only did they have to read a book, the typical book for class, right? They had
Hmm.
to read, but she also, for one a semester, so they weren't overloaded, she made them say, I want you to choose a book of your choosing to read just for read. And then, they would have to write like a small 5-page essay to prove that they read the book. But I
Yeah.
think that, um because my middle son, from the time he was 5, does not like to read, has never liked to read. I mean, I can clearly remember when he was in kindergarten and they had Garfield, and Garfield would ask you questions, and
Hmm.
Garfield was either happy, kind of no emotions, or like angry, sad. And when it came to the do you like to read and all those questions, every Garfield that was angry, sad was circled. Like reading is not his thing. It's never been
Hmm.
his thing. And so I think he began to appreciate reading when he had to do that assignment. You know,
Yeah, I think I back then I would have appreciated it more if we had the choice to actually read something we were interested in. But
and yeah,
stories like The Great Gatsby and The Catcher in the Rye, and like they just never really interested me all that much. I feel like I couldn't ever relate to the characters, you know what I mean?
yeah. So anyway, so that was my question about reading. So I
Thank
encourage,
you.
yeah, I encourage you all to, we have lots of times on our hands. So I encourage you all to find a book. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a fiction book. It can be a nonfiction book, but read something that pushes you out of your comfort zone, that, requires you to possibly change or evolve the way you're thinking and what you're doing.
Yeah. So that was your cultural questions. So this
Yes.
week I have global.
Okay. Lay it on
So
me. I'm ready.
again, this was a user submitted question again. Sorry, a viewer submitted question. So, my question for you this week is, what form of government do you think is best in the world, and why do many foreign governments attack others for not having the same form of government? So, I think this question comes specifically from like the battles over communism, right? So, like, the US would constantly put its foot in a country that was not a democracy. So,
Okay.
what are your thoughts on that?
Wow. Okay. So this is like a two-part. Like, this is like, you're mixing the ketchup and the mayo and you get fry sauce. All right. So,
Yeah.
okay. So let me tackle the first part. So the first part you asked about, what form of government do I think is best, correct?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So if you look back over the eons and eons and eons of years, right? I don't ever think there has been one perfect government, right?
Mm-hmm.
because think about all those ancient civilizations. They had government for a while, and then something would happen, and then they would have another form of government, and something would happen. So I don't think there is ever going to be one true perfect government form. I
Hmm.
do think, right? I do believe that the way that the United States government was initially intended to work would probably be the closest form of government that I
Hmm.
think would work. And here's why. So when our founding fathers founded the United States government, right? It was new. It was inventive. It was thinking outside the box, and it was something that has never been done before, right? It was a new experiment because, listen, everybody didn't think that it was going to pass or it was going to stay, right? Nobody thought the United States would be here 200 plus years later, right?
Yeah.
They were like, oh, it might last 5 years and then it's going to be done.
Hmm.
So I think when they set up the government the way that they initially intended it to function and work would probably be the best form of government. Fast forward to now, and I think the problem that we have with our government is there's so many exceptions and convolutions and just so many like different points and aspects. And
Hmm.
it just, this person needs this and this person needs that. And that is, I truly believe that is not how our founding fathers thought government would evolve. I think they wanted it to evolve, right? Because with anything, you have to have it evolve and change as times change. And I think that was the initial intended purpose. And I do believe that that's what they wanted, but I don't think they saw it evolving into what we have now. Um,
So
which
I'm gonna disagree with you a little bit
you're
because
going to
what
disagree? Okay.
I am. So, what I think is that though the framers had in mind a system of government that they thought would be the best at the time, and arguably at that time and that day and age, it was probably the best system of government. However, I think that it was set up solely for white people to succeed, white old men to succeed, right?
Okay.
You know what I mean? Like at that time, women were definitely around.
Mm-hmm.
Black people were around as slaves, right?
Yes.
And nobody really included those people in our system of government. So for me personally, I feel like thinking back to Greek and Roman times when you had a direct democracy, right?
Yes.
Every citizen had a vote for what was going to happen with the government, right?
Mm-hmm.
You had senators, you had elected people in office that could sponsor legislation and could introduce new ideas, but ultimately the people voted. And
Okay.
that system really only succeeds in a small civilization, right? You can't have
Yes.
350 million people going to the polls once a week to vote on something, right? It's just not it's not sustainable. Nobody would do it, right?
It's not
So
realistic either. Yes.
no, it's definitely not realistic. But I do think that we, in our current form of government, are extremely underrepresented. Meaning the people's house was supposed to expand in size for population every 10 years or so, right? Every time you
Okay.
take a census, they were supposed to reevaluate it and expand the house. That's how it was meant to work. It was meant off of population. Right
Yes.
now, we have 435 House of Representatives members who
Yes.
are the elected members to oversee 350 million people, right? There's no
Mm-hmm.
way that those people encompass all the beliefs and values of 350 million people. I don't know. You can argue that all you want. I just don't think it's believable that such a small population can agree with on everything with 350 million people, right? So what I think is that the government needs to be expanded. We need more elected members. We need more people in the House and arguably even in the Senate, right? We need more
Okay.
people so more views and ideologies can be encompassed so we move forward as a country together, right? And we don't have this polarization. I think the two-party system is really messed up, right? I think we should transition to a more parliamentary system where people can vote for a party that they actually align with without the fear of, oh, the other side's going to get power. You know what I mean?
Okay. 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 So I partially agree with you. I partially agree that, it's hard to have such a small portion of government represent such a vast population. But I think it kind of goes back to my earlier thoughts where, and I agree with you that when they initially set up the government, obviously African Americans weren't represented or women weren't represented. There was
Mm-hmm.
definitely people, marginalized people that were not representative in form of government. And that's where you have government is supposed to evolve and change. And it's taken many years. But I do agree to an extent that, yes, even the government today does not represent a large population of people. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I have said publicly, now this election I did vote, I did make a choice, but the two previous elections, I wrote my own name in because I did not identify with either candidate. I didn't like either candidate either. Do you know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? And so in my head, I I truly felt this and I truly believe this. I made the personal choice that I was going to write my own name in and vote for myself because I did not want to have to make a choice on two parties that I just one don't agree with and one I didn't like either candidate. I didn't feel like either candidate represented what I want government to be.
Mm-hmm.
I have said this before. I truly think for true government to be effective and to be evolving, I really think that we need to have term limits on senators and House of Representatives. You have senators that have been in power for decades.
Mm-hmm.
Decades. True
I think
government.
the longest serving rep in the US right now who's still serving, he's up to like I think 40 years or something like that he's been serving.
And that's the thing. True government, it was a public service, and public service is you go, you serve for your amount of time, you leave and go back to your regular day job. It is not
Yeah.
a public service is not a full-time career. It's not. It is meant to be I serve, just like in the military, I serve for my 4 or 5 years. And then if I want to serve again, I can, but I can leave. And I
Mm-hmm.
really think that government needs to kind of be the same way. These politicians that have made a career out of public service, that's not what that was meant to do. Our founding fathers strongly did not feel that, you should be in power or be in public service for years and years and years. I mean, look at George Washington. He could have been president for a really long time, right?
Mm-hmm.
He could have been president, but he recognized that that's not what true government is. True government is about evolving and changing. I think we need term limits for senators. I think we need term limits for House of Representatives. What those term limits are, I don't know. I think you should base it off similarly as to what the president is. It's either
Mm-hmm.
2 terms or 10 years. I think that's a good starting base. But
Yeah.
for that's how we are going to get the change and going to get the representation to embody more of the population. Because
Mm-hmm.
when you have people, like you said, that have been in government for 40 years, I mean, let's face it, my tax dollars and your tax dollars have been paying their salary for 40 years. Like, let
Yeah.
that sink in your head. 40 years
I
you
mean,
have
either
been.
either way, we're gonna pay someone's salary. It just happens to be the same person for 40 years.
I know, but that just, I mean, that to me is mind boggling for
Yeah.
something that is considered public service,
Yeah.
right?
No,
Like,
I do agree with you. I do agree that there should be term limits for both chambers of Congress. I personally have thought about this in depth. I think it should be 12 years because that's 2 terms in the Senate. You get 2 terms as a senator, or you get 6 terms in the House. You do your stuff, you get out, and I think it would solve a lot of the problems where representatives don't want to vote on hot topic issues in fear that they won't get reelected, right? So
yeah.
it may not happen in your first term as senator. You may still make decisions based off of reelection, but after you're reelected the second time, you're more free to do things because there's no third term, right? All right, so let's touch on the second half of the question a little bit. So second half of the question was relating to governmental wars. So, what do you think about the pursuit to install democracy in other countries? And this obviously happened with Russia, with the Cold War, and notably also with North Korea and the Korean War.
So, oh, this is a tough one. I think that I think it's finding balance. I think we have to like guide and help other countries, but I also feel at the same time that we can't go in with guns blazing and be like, this is what we're doing. This is what we got to do. We got to stomp out communism. We got to stomp out this because I guess I don't know. This is tough for me. This is tough for me because I think there is some good when you go in with good intentions to
Hmm.
help those countries find a better way, right? If you're
Yeah.
going in with the right purpose, but I also have to believe that at the same time you have to let your citizens and your people make the decisions,
Hmm.
whether or not it's right or wrong, because you're not a part of that country. So you're not there seeing the things that happen day in and day out, how they're living, what they're doing, what is their daily life. So I think that and like back in the 50s and 60s, you're right. The America was like, hey, we're coming in, we're gonna get in there and show everybody democracy, which was okay, sure. But at the
Hmm.
same time, you have to know your own boundaries and your own limits. And I think sometimes during those times in the 50s and 60s, we kind of forgot where our boundaries and limits were. And we got into some sticky situations like the Vietnam War or conflict, whatever you want to call it. We got into some sticky situations that in the end did not end well for us.
Yeah.
Right. And
I
so,
think I think the issue that I have from it, and this is probably more of coming at it from like a worldview type of thing, is that I feel like the US has a history of stepping in where they're not necessarily wanted or even being called upon to step in for ulterior motives, right? And this happened with Iraq and in Afghanistan, where the US stepped in and sent military troops in, but it didn't really do anybody good, right? Civilians were still being murdered, except it was by our drone strikes and our, you know what I mean, and our military forces for the sake of oil, right? Looking back on history and looking at the struggle between communism and democracy, I think a lot of the argument isn't seen from the other side, right? So put yourself in the shoes of somebody who was living in Soviet Russia at that time. And depending on where you are, it may have not been that bad. You know what I mean?
mhm.
And that may sound awful to a lot of the people listening out there, but I've had many conversations with my grandparents who are from Soviet Russia and who grew up in that system. And I never hear them really talk about them constantly being hungry or nobody was working, everybody was miserable, right?
Yes.
Sure, there was bad parts to the system. My grandpa told me a funny story, what he deemed was a funny story. Um, he was talking about one of his neighbors who um, got obliterated drunk, right?
Okay.
And he walks into his house, and in the house was a framed picture of Joseph Stalin. And he looked at the picture and he said something along the lines of, he basically just said, like, "Hi, mustache man," right?
Okay.
The next day he was taken away and he was basically sent to a gulag. So yeah, there were issues. I'm not denying that there were issues. But on the other hand, like, you had free education, right? And people were paid in a tiered system. So my grandfather went and he got an education for many years and he was making decent money providing for his family. So I think
Okay.
it really comes down to who you talk to and putting yourself in the other person's shoes. And I don't think it should be the job of the United States to attempt to fix issues that they themselves deem an issue, right? I
Yeah.
think it should be more left up to a bigger world power, something like the United Nations, right?
Okay. Yeah.
I think it should be left up to a greater number of representatives of countries to decide whether a country is committing atrocities or not, or whether they need to send military force in, right? Because I think oftentimes the US just goes in guns blazing, and then it turns out that you find out 20 years later that, oh, they just wanted to overthrow that government for oil rights or drilling rights or whatever, right?
Yeah. No, I think this is the other thing that this is kind of almost like a side question to your question. I
Hmm.
think also what is interesting to note that a lot of times that when the US does step in, when the United States does step in, they're stepping in for issues that aren't even really addressed in our country, right? It's like an
Yeah. Oh,
oxymoron.
yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it's kind when you think about it, sometimes you're like, wait a minute, you're gonna go fix that,
Yeah.
but yet
Yes.
down the block we
Yeah.
have that. Why aren't we fixing it here?
I mean, a perfect example of that. Sorry, before you ask your question, a perfect example of that is during the North Korean famine, right? So during the North Korean famine, the entire country had a food shortage basically, and millions of people died. During the
Okay.
like during World War II in
Not
the
okay, but yes,
US,
I'm following your line of thought.
yeah, during World War II, there was extreme food shortages in the US too. Millions of people may not have died, but there was people who were definitely hungry. And looking back in the Great Depression, the same thing happened, right? So
Yes.
those issues, and yes, the North Korean famine was a bad point in history. It did only last a finite amount of time, right? It was over at some point. And think about being the US during the Great Depression struggled with those exact same things. People were constantly hungry. So imagine a country like Russia stepping in and overthrowing the government because the people are starving.
Yeah. No, I just think that it's I don't understand why, because I think, okay, so I will say this as someone that always wants to help and kind of be a giver and help where I can and help to the best of my ability. I think sometimes we as the United States feel that way. We feel like, okay, we have the power and the ability to help, so we're going to help. So I think the intention starts good, but then when everybody puts their hand in the cookie jar to get a
Hmm.
cookie, right? The intentions
Yeah.
kind of go sideways from the initial of I have the power and the ability to help and do what I can to the best of my ability, so I'm going to try to help. and then everybody gets their hand in the pot and it looks completely different than what the initial intention was. So
Hmm.
I think that part of me thinks we just have to find a balance between, yes, we can help, but also keep the intentions pure of why we're helping and what we're doing there, but also be mindful that you got to fix your own stuff in your own yard before you go in somebody else's yard and try to fix theirs,
Yeah.
right? Too. I
Yeah.
think it's a fine line, and it's a fine line that we have not found yet, but
Hmm.
I always hope that we will find that line. I just don't know when. And I don't know if I'll see it in my lifetime, and maybe it'll happen in your lifetime, Michael. Maybe it'll
No,
happen
I don't know if
that we
it'll
will
happen in
find that
mine
fine
either.
line. Well, it may. You never know. We may find that line of we are going to help with the purest intentions, yet at the same time, we got to fix our own stuff in our own backyard too.
Hmm.
So I always look for the good. I try to look for the good in the best that I can. Um, that tomorrow will be better because you know it can't. It really, like, it's like that saying, it can't get any worse, right? I mean, maybe it
Oh, I think it
can,
could
but
definitely get worse,
for the
but
most
let's not
part,
say that. Look at us. 2 years
you
ago,
think it
we
could
were
get
good.
worse? I
Oh
don't.
yeah.
Well, I
Oh
don't
yeah.
think. I don't.
I
I
think it could
mean,
get so much worse. So
I
much
look
worse.
at
Look
it.
at us.
I look at the last year, right, and just it got. I mean, it was pretty rough for a lot of people. It was pretty rough,
Yeah.
but we're hopefully now starting to come out the other side, and
Oh, I don't think we're
I
coming
hope
out the
that
other side, but anyway, that's a different question for a
we're,
different
we're
day.
slowly.
Yeah.
I know
I
that is a
mean,
different question, but
yeah.
what I'm saying is that, like, as far as government goes, like, I hope that with all the change that we have had, really, literally in the last 3.5 months, and especially earlier this month, not even earlier this month, but 2 weeks ago, that we are
Hmm.
starting to come out the other side, and that we are
Yeah.
finding a better way, right? Whether you're Democrat or Republican or something in between, we need to collectively find a better way to make government work, right? Because
Hmm.
clearly, what we've been doing, more specifically, what we've been doing the last 50 to 60 years,
Hmm.
is not necessarily working anymore, right?
No, it's not.
And we've
There's
got to
things
find a
that
way to,
definitely need to change.
yeah. And I mean, I hope, and I think we're starting to see that. I think we're starting to see more people from, quote unquote, the generation Z and the millennial generation, the generation that's considered millennial,
Yeah.
like, step up to the game and be like, listen, yo, we gotta do something different because this
Hmm.
is not helping anybody, you know?
Yeah.
And like I said, whether you're Democratic or Republican, it's gotta be about the collective and what's gonna move us and evolve government forward in a positive way,
Look at
right?
us tying it back into episode one. So if you haven't seen episode one, make sure you listen back and get that reference. So that was my
So,
question.
yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah, that was
thank you
a
for
good
your
question.
response.
That one made me think, man.
Yeah,
That
it
one,
was a
like,
thinker.
really tested my resolve and nerve.
Thank you to our viewers for submitting those questions. Those were very much appreciated. It gave us a little break. Stop thinking about so many thought provoking
Yeah,
things, right? So yeah.
I know. So, well, this was a fun episode to do. We've done 4 episodes now, right? Like,
Yeah.
this is insane
Yeah.
that we've done 4 episodes.
I know this is our
So,
last one of the month.
anyway, well, yes, for sure. And we're already into a new month with new things. So hopefully you will tune in next week to a new episode of Sliding with D and M. I'm Dina.
And I'm Michael Petuhoff. Thanks guys for listening.